Welcome everyone again if you're just joining. ITDP has been documenting different approaches in parking policy while also spearheading the change that is needed to help build more compact, sustainable cities where, of course, public transport, walking and cycling can thrive as more attractive forms of transportation. My colleague is also dropping several links there around the publications and webinars that we previously had on the topic. We're happy to announce the launch of a brand new publication, which highlights case studies in off-street parking reform. We'll hear shortly about the publication from my colleague Dana at ITDP, and you can download it with the link in the chat. Today, we're meeting representatives from Salvador, Brazil. From Rio de Janeiro, I'm really sorry, and from California, United States, to look into how parking reform is being advanced by the cities in these two distinct regions, and also what kind of approaches they're using in terms of engagement, regulation, and governance. We'll start with Dana Yanoka, Program Manager at ITDP Global. She's the author of the publication I mentioned, and also a number of other related reports and policy guides on traffic demand management and active transport. Dana will also moderate the session. Then we'll pass it on to speakers. First, we'll hear from Gabriel Denadai, who is the Assistant to the Secretary of Urban Planning at Rio de Janeiro City Government. Gabriel facilitated a number of policies while in his position, and the new building code which addressed the parking requirements. And next, we'll hear from Mark Vukcevic, Director of State Policy for Streets for All, a California-based advocacy organization. He will share a story of the parking reform in California with highlights on stakeholder collaboration and the cities that follow the progressive policy to end parking minimums. So with this slightly lengthy introduction, I think it's time to pass it on to Dana to give us a bit of a background for the session.
Great, thanks so much, Ivona, and thanks everyone for joining. It's great to see so many of you here representing so many different cities and places around the world. I think as Ivona brings up my slides, my goal for my presentation today is really just to provide some initial context and share a little bit about what we found from the report. The bulk of the report focuses on some case studies, which unfortunately we won't have time to go into today, but we are grateful to have Gabriella and Mark here to share their experiences into additional places that we didn't include in the report, but just show kind of a momentum building around this topic. So you can go to the next slide, Ivona. So first, I just want to define what we actually mean when we talk about parking reform. And there's sort of these two distinct avenues. There's on-street parking and off-street parking. And even though they're sort of distinct, they're really closely connected and should absolutely be planned and managed together wherever possible. When we talk about on-street parking, we're really focused on pricing on-street spaces, both in sort of commercial areas and also, residential neighborhoods. And we're also focused on managing curbside space so that the most efficient and high demand, low carbon modes are being prioritized at the curb. So we're not going to be talking so much about on-street parking today, but ITDP and other organizations have some really great resources on how to tackle on-street parking. So I definitely encourage you to check those out, and we can share some of those in the follow-up as well. Today, we're going to be focusing on off-street parking, specifically looking at removing off-street parking minimums. And off-street parking is really important to think about for cities and even for higher levels of government because it often accounts for a really large share of land in city centers. That's really valuable land that could be used for more productive uses. So things like housing, retail, services, green space, all of the things that make cities more livable. You can go to the next slide. So like I mentioned, there is definitely momentum building around parking reform. We're seeing a number of cities and like I said, higher levels of government that are moving to eliminate parking minimums, especially in North America. And we're also seeing coverage in the mainstream media that's really establishing this link between parking and these kind of bigger outcomes like housing affordability, emissions, and other, other kind of broader topics that kind of speak to the livability of cities. Next slide. So just thinking a little bit more about how parking and particularly off-street parking actually impacts cities. I think many of us probably have heard the phrase free parking isn't free. Everyone in cities, even if you don't drive often, even if you don't even own a car, ends up paying for parking through a variety of ways. Things like time, higher cost of goods, and also kind of broader things like air quality and unsafe streets. And a lot of that is brought about through parking minimums. Parking minimums are requirements for parking that's provided when new buildings are built or existing buildings are redeveloped. And in a lot of cases, these really aren't informed by market demand. Parking minimums are sort of arbitrarily set, and they don't really allow for context of where the building is located and whether folks are driving to that place or not. And these parking minimums have really resulted in a number of negative impacts on cities. I mentioned inefficient use of space. In a lot of cases, housing and service shortages are a big challenge. And because parking has to be provided, that means less space for those types of uses. Things like threats to urban fabric and additional costs to build and maintain these facilities, we see across the board. Next slide. So even though we're focusing primarily in this discussion on parking minimums, eliminating and reducing them, I wanted to note that there's a whole host of other tools that can help contribute to off-street parking reform. And I think Mark and Gabrielle will hopefully touch on some of these other ones that are also, can be really critical for success. But I did want to also mention here that these tools and strategies can be implemented at different scales, and that can often be helpful to build kind of buy-in and support for these types of policies. So thinking about maybe starting in zones and then thinking about phasing some of these strategies citywide as you build buy-in. Next slide. So like I mentioned in the report, we do focus on case studies. We have 6 cities and 1 country. And the stories are really interesting. So I definitely encourage you to check those out in the report. Today, unfortunately, I can't go into the details for all of these, but I do want to focus on some of the lessons learned from across the case studies and that are informed by those stories. You can go to the next one, Ivona. And again, the first one here is thinking about removing parking minimums. The case studies show that parking reform can take a really long time to go into effect. So we really do recommend starting or like getting the ball rolling with removing parking minimums. This might seem kind of bold, kind of ambitious, but removing parking minimums is actually inherently incremental in the sense that parking supply will end up changing pretty slowly over time. And the other thing that's important here that can help to encourage cities to take up parking, removing of parking minimums, is that there's now a lot of cities that have done this. And so you don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of really helpful lessons. Some we document from the case studies in the report, but there's many, many more cities that and higher levels of government even that are taking this up. And it can be really helpful to draw on those experiences. Next slide. Leveraging political will at the right level of government. I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it's one of the takeaways that I think was really informative for us. We did see across the case studies that you do need political buy-in at the top to really push parking reform forward. So for cities, that would be the mayor's office. For higher levels of government, it might be like a head of state. On this slide is a picture of Julianne Genter. She's a member of parliament from New Zealand who really championed parking reform as a way to tackle housing affordability. And New Zealand is a really interesting case because they took up parking reform at the national level. And that really helped to encourage widespread adoption of these policies because each individual city wasn't required to kind of build their own policy from scratch. And that allowed uptake to happen more quickly. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that type of process from Mark, since California also took up parking reform at a higher level, at the state level. And then I also wanted to note in this area that staff capacity came up across the case studies, and the need to build staff capacity, especially because a lot of existing sort of municipal agency staff are not necessarily technical experts on parking. So it's important to consider how much staff capacity you have when you're thinking about designing these policies. If your staff capacity is limited, thinking about prioritizing sort of simple, more straightforward policies compared to more complex ones that have a lot of sort of complex calculations that go into things like impact fees or parking maximums, for example. You can go to the next one. Communication and messaging also came up as a big takeaway and contributed to success in a lot of the case studies. Parking reform tends to be a pretty technical topic, and not many, sort of people in the general public have a background or understanding of these technical aspects and terms, nor should they. So that means that it's really important to engage with all different types of stakeholders throughout the planning and implementation process. So speaking with residents, speaking with business owners and bigger employers, and really focusing not on the technical aspects, but more on the story of how parking impacts people's daily lives, and really focusing on language that links the potential for rethinking how space is used in neighborhoods and in cities, as opposed to focusing on things like removing or eliminating parking. And then also here we found that participatory processes were really useful. Atlanta did some great work with resident and local business workshops. Sao Paulo also used a participatory process, and so did Mexico City. Mexico City actually engaged with journalists in a really interesting way, kind of pushing some of these parking reform benefits and the narrative around that out through mainstream media. Next slide. So data is also really important to help communicate, especially the local impacts of parking reform. It can really help to kind of underscore the importance of addressing parking and how that relates to individual residents and their communities. I think maps like the one on this slide, this is from the Parking Reform Network, are really helpful in showing just the sheer amount of space in downtowns that's allocated for parking. So this is actually Atlanta, and all of the space in red is off-street parking. So showing residents this type of data, and again, helping them to envision what that space could be used for otherwise, helps to make the issue a lot more personal, and can help build buy-in. Next slide. We also found that packaging parking alongside some complementary policies was a successful approach. And by complementary policies, I mean things like adjusting zoning codes to build up housing density. So Atlanta, Minneapolis, and New Zealand all packaged their zoning and parking policy reforms together. And that kind of shielded the off-street parking reforms from generating some public backlash that might otherwise have happened if the parking reforms were introduced on their own. And then last slide, Ivona. The last piece here is really thinking about linking parking reform to specific outcomes. So that in a lot of cases was actually affordable housing, but it can be even more specific or like hyper-local, problems that need to be addressed. So in the case of Beijing, parking reforms were linked to addressing really rampant encroachment of vehicles on public space. So whatever that outcome is, again, it really needs to be integrated into messaging so that people do understand kind of the motivation behind the proposed changes, and then again can start to kind of envision a different and better future for their city. So that's it for me. I think we'll do questions after the presentation. So I'll turn things over to Bernadette.
Hello, Gabriel.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those who are on another timer. Let me share my screen so that I can begin. All right, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about our perspective from Rio and the reform we made starting 2018 when we did the building code. So it's important to note that we started with the building code, and the building code, it deals with private land. So we had no authority on street parking or public parking. So that's where we began. And later on, we have some other developments. So Rio, a bit of a strange city, lots of mountains, the ocean. So transportation has always been somewhat difficult, especially public transportation. But that kindly improves a bit over time, but a little photo of how it was in the 70s. We have a pivotal moment in the 70s when there's the automobile boom. We start to have local production of automobiles in Brazil, and the ownership of the private automobile increases enormously. And the cities were not prepared for that. So you can see that that photo, I think it's in 1970, this photo, by the beach, everybody with their Volkswagens. That was the top selling car here because it was cheap. So everybody going to the beach, you can see the crowded. I think this is Ipanema Beach. So let's start it. Let me first show you how the buildings were before these the 70s. You can I'm taking as example the beachfront of Rio, because most of you will be familiar with this this region. It's our postcard region. So, but the buildings, you can see that in the background there, they had almost no parking spaces. It was not that there were no parking minimums. They were optional building parking spaces, and since having a car was an expensive thing, not everyone had it. So these buildings are from the 50s, some late 40s, early 60s maximum. So as you can see, if you look down, no parking spaces. And where would people park? On the streets. So when that boom of the automobile in the late 60s, early 70s came, people were shocked. People were infatuated with the automobile. It will solve the cities. We can go anywhere, we can drive anywhere, but we don't have where to park them. So we made the last building code reform was in 1976 in Rio. And it was exaggerated. We demanded a parking minimum that was huge. For example, you would have one parking space for every sleeping room, every bedroom in an apartment. Plus, if you had 2 living rooms, the second, the third, the fourth, each one would require an extra parking space. So the usual layout, which was an apartment with, let's say, 2 bedrooms, dining room and sitting room, you would need 3 parking spaces for that apartment as a minimum. And they had to be built. And in some areas, like beachfront in Copacabana, you would have to add an extra one. Because what was the thought process? Well, we have a lot of buildings without parking spaces. Let's build new buildings with extra parking spaces, so people in the first buildings can rent parking spaces in the new buildings. And we can take the cars off the street. So we built, you can see in this photo here, these are buildings from the 80s, already built under this new regulation. You can see that there's 4 levels. The 4 first levels are comprised of parking, even though there's glass, because these are high-end buildings. But the 4 first levels are comprised of parkings. And we can have another example here. This is also in Copacabana Beach. You can see this in the corner here, this brown building, 4 levels of parking, and then the building starts. And that's terrible for the city. You've got no facade, you've got no relation between the street and the building. The first floor of residential units is actually the 5th or 6th floor up there. So there's no relation between street and building, no shops, no nothing. You put a monolith in the street and it's empty. And that proliferated throughout the city. We had many, I'm going there, many examples. And when we arrived at the reform period, which was 2017, 2018, we wanted to tackle that. So we had a lot of help from ITDP Brazil, that should be said. We studied a lot the case of São Paulo, whom they had worked with, and they presented us Mexico City as well. It was a good benchmark for us. And we decided to go for a no minimums approach. So let me just summarize this situation. So before the 70s, optional parking, you can see here on the left on this building. This building is actually older. I think it's from the 30s or 40s. No parking. Where would people park? On the streets. This is downtown Rio, the main square in downtown Rio. Everybody would park anywhere. But we had an interesting public transit system that was based on a tram, on the electric tram. That was mostly everywhere in the city. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't good, but it wasn't particularly good, but it was everywhere and everywhere used it. Everyone used it. We had no subways back then. After the 70s, what we got, mandatory parking. So another one of those buildings with 4 parking spaces that generated even more traffic, especially because downtown is even more ancient than this time. So no parking spaces on downtown ever. And we switched the public transportation to buses, which was a sort of a mistake because buses were in the middle of the traffic. So they had no priority. The tramways, they usually had priority. We built our 2 lines of subways, which are small compared to the needs of the city, but that's where we stand. So during the revision, what were our thoughts? We'll propose no parking minimums, and we'll go a step further. Let's make a maximum. The first parking unit you build will be free. 4 units, now for each unit, each residential unit. But if you go to a second parking space, you will have to pay a fee, and the third will have to pay an even bigger fee, and so on. And we wanted to force some biking parkings in the buildings and everything. So Dana talked a lot about help from political entities. The mayor was strongly for that, but we hit a couple of walls. The first wall was the union of the construction firms, so developers. They had already realized that the minimums were extensive, and they were turning building into a very expensive endeavor. So for instance, if you, in certain areas of the city, in Copacabana, for instance, if you build a single room apartment, like I don't know, 50 square meters, you would have to build 2 parking spaces for that apartment. So these 2 parking spaces would take up more than the 50 square meters if you measure up access routes and ramps and everything. So you were building twice the space you were selling. So Rio has a housing problem where small apartments are rare and difficult to come by, because after the 70s reform, they became expensive. So we have 2-3 bedroom units, but smaller ones disappeared. And they had already identified that we want to build cheaper apartments. They are expensive. And one of the ways to get there is to remove the parking demands. Obviously, they did not want to pay a fee, because if you're going to build a high-end condo, you have to have a parking space or it becomes a bit difficult to sell. So they were immediately against the parking maximums and the parking fees. Immediately that was shot on arrival. It didn't take off. But they were in favor of no parking minimums. They were totally in favor. But the city council was not into it. So what did we negotiate? What could be approved? A minimum of 1 parking space for each 4 units of residents in the building, if the building was located near 800 meters of a mass transit station. And as mass transit, we would call subway, train, because we have a suburban train network. And we have what we call subway on wheels, which is a system of buses that feeds the subway. So we managed to get also that counted as mass transit. This arrangement, 800 meters around these stations, would cover most of the city, most of the heart of the city, let's say, because we have this. Rio is a very, very big city, unbelievably big, the administration. So you have some suburban parts that are very far away and that have no public transit whatsoever, only small buses. So this part was obviously out. But the central region, the most dense region, would be mostly all inside that. And it was approved after some battles, and the license fees obviously were rejected. And we got also parking for bicycles on new buildings mandatory. So we got that, and that's been in effect since 2018. But as Dana said, those reforms, they take a little bit of time to show up, to manifest themselves. And we had the pandemics soon after, so everything was a bit delayed. And we're starting to have now these buildings built, being delivered to the buyers. What was our main idea? It was to free a bit the developer, the architect, so that it could make a building with mixed types. It's a thing in Rio that if you have a building with, I don't know, apartments of 3 bedrooms, all the apartments are the same. All the apartments have 3 bedrooms. If we allow some leeway in the parking, we thought we could have mixed buildings, like 2, 3, 1 bedroom units mixed in the building. So a bigger unit would have a parking space, a smaller unit would not. So it would make it cheaper. We are starting to go that way, but not quite yet. But anyways, what happens now? We are doing another revision, not on the building code stands, but This time we have to make the urban, we call it director scheme. It's the urban legislation that takes care of zoning of the entire city. So in that, we are able to insert some provisions for parking, for inside parking. So what are we? It's not been voted yet. It should be voted in November, in the end. But we've been discussing it for the last 2 years. What have we put in this legislation? No parking minimums again, 0. But this time I think it has traction. Probably it will pass, regardless of the existence of mass transit around. It will pass for the core of the city. These suburban regions will maintain the demand for a quarter of parking spaces. We tried again the licensing fees for extra parkings or the parking maximums, and it was again shot down immediately by the developing firms. And we also remember when I showed you these buildings that have these floors for parking. These floors are free in a sense that you can build 10 floors in this region. The 10 floors are only of apartments. The parking floors are free. So we are reducing the number of free floors that you can use for parking, only 2 now. And that's got traction. So it should be approved as well. And it should go now in November. Things are progressing. But the interesting thing to say is who is against the no parking minimums policy? First and foremost, the neighbors association. People in Rio still think that they should have lots of parking spaces on site because that will help them remove the cars from the street. So the neighbors association are very vocal against that, but they should, the work we've done with the council, with the city council, should counteract that, I think. And even when we try to explain them all the benefits of reducing parking, they don't get it. It should be said that also the transit authority of Rio is not very keen on that. And I can understand that because on the first level, it increases that problem of transit, of more cars trying to find parking spaces. But I think in the long time, it will drive people towards public transportation, and it will generate demand for public transportation. You know, it's one of the things we talk in Rio. If the rich people have their own cars, they don't demand public transportation. So the poorer people get stuck with public transportation. They don't have that much of a voice to demand that it improves. So if we force everyone to go to the public transportation, the demand from the entire society is bigger. And so government will pay more attention to that.
Gabriel, apologies to interrupt, but I think we have to move on very soon.
I'm finished. This is the last thing.
Thank
And
you.
let me put a bit of a seed of a question for the future. What we are thinking, but it's not in these revisions. A city with, first of all, the infrastructure for electric cars, but we have to think about a city where the cars are robotic, like the vision that Musk has it, of cars that drive themselves, and that these cars, they do not need the same level of parking space as we have today. So in the future, all this parking space that we built, probably we're going to have to find a use for that, which will not be parking. And so that is a little seed for discussion later on. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. We learned a lot from you. And also there's a link to a story from Rio in the chat if you want to read more. But with that, let's move on to Mark to present on his work.
So can everyone see my screen? Awesome. Yeah, my name is Mark Fuchsovich. I'm the Director of State Policy for Streets for All. I love what Gabriel said, and there's a lot of echoes to Los Angeles and California, which also doesn't have as much transit as you think a major state like California should have, and the kind of the economic disparities that come from that that conversation. I'm going to give a little bit of background of the California parking minimum fight, a little background on what Streets for All is, and then I'll talk about kind of potential next steps. And I'll also contextualize, this is an international audience, so I might use the word half mile later, and that's about 800 meters, just to contextualize to an international audience. So what is Streets for All? That's the organization I work for. We're an advocacy organization based in Los Angeles, but the bulk of my work is in Sacramento, California, which is the state capital of California. We put a special focus on biking, walking, public transportation, urban land use policy, and parking policy. We work this year actively in the state legislature with 10 sponsored bills. And locally, we're really known for our ballot initiative, Healthy Streets Los Angeles, which will require the city of LA to implement bike, walk, and bus elements as it repaves streets. So on a regular basis, and start integrating that into its repaving schedule. Oh, there we go. So here's some of their statewide work. I'll talk a little bit more about at least the first bill on this list, but there's a number of bills that we have about pedestrian safety and other things on this urbanism note. But I really want to talk about the story of parking minimums. And so I kind of, on this slide, started it at 2011. I think you can actually really start it back in the 1920s and the 1940s, before at least Los Angeles and California had parking minimums. And then I think probably due to the rapid industrialization of the United States after World War II, Los Angeles was one of the first places that started having parking minimums in the 1940s and 50s. And it very quickly became seen as a development barrier. But that, despite that, we have persisted and continue to persist to have parking minimums. So the story of kind of parking reform in California really started in some sense in 2011 with a bill to end parking minimums, and it essentially got nowhere. That it promoted the conversation a little bit, but it really got nowhere for all in all. In 2021, a legislator who's a big champion of these sort of policies authored a bill called AB 1401, and it mirrored the bill that will be the following year, AB 2097. And that bill ended parking minimums within a half mile of major transit stops, 800 meters. So in that bill failed, and it failed kind of unceremoniously, or not a lot of fanfare, because of a single senator, a single individual in the California state legislature. And I'll talk about that story in a second. But then ultimately, the thing that I'm here for, and the kind of the thing that California is known for, is probably being, at least in the United States, in one fell swoop, the largest amount of land area removing parking minimums in one single go. And that was in 2022. That was last year. It took actually in effect January 1 of this year, effectively ended huge swaths of parking minimums within a half mile of transit. So I can't go back. There we go. So the story of parking reform is like, so how did we get this done? How did this happen? And so I actually was thinking about this slide in the context of that one senator and the conversation that us at Streets for All had with that one senator. But I'll also talk about this kind of more broadly, which is, so we had really strong advocates, and those were advocates from some from labor, but a lot from the environmental and the housing groups, especially, and the kind of transportation groups as well. You had politically adept developers, and I'll talk a little bit more about like what that means later on. And we actually had UCLA faculty, and that's the University of California, Los Angeles. Many people may know that Donald Shoup, the book on the right that's pictured right here, is a UCLA faculty member. He wrote the kind of seminal text on parking literature. And so we didn't have Donald Shoup on, we had his colleague on a call with the state senator himself. And what we did is we broke down the barriers, we answered misconceptions, and we ultimately made our position very firmly clear to the state senator who had originally blocked this bill. The other thing too, that not necessarily in the context of this conversation with the state senator, is that we also brought in a Chamber of Commerce. So we're talking about pro-business groups, basically explain how parking minimums really hampered business efforts. And so ultimately what ended up happening is that bill came again the following year, the subsequent year, and the governor signs it into law because it passes the California legislature. And not only does the governor sign it into law, he makes this little fun promotional video that I got this really bad screenshot of the governor right here, where he's really saying that like this is really important climate and land use policy. And it's not only just signing a bill in the back room, actually actively promoting the bill that he had no hand in writing, but he signed it and thought it was an important policy. So what is the result? The result, so the picture on the left is the greater Los Angeles metro area. This is a metro area of about 20 million people. Every one of the blue dots right now has removed parking minimums completely for business and commercial use, and largely for housing use. There's some kind of caveats there that I won't go into. And this is incredibly important because in a place like California, we're in a housing crisis. And our land is incredibly expensive. And so parking costs in California range between $5,000 to $80,000 per parking spot if you have to build it underground or in a like subterranean or in a parking garage. And so this is now a huge development burden that has been taken away. And we've already seen some of the benefits of this policy. And so this is, I just can't understate how important this is. Especially these areas that are within a half mile of major transit stops are really going to be transforming over the course of the next few years because of the other work that the legislature is doing, also just to promote housing in general, reduce other development standards. So I'm going to just really quickly, I'm going to transition a little bit to like, what are the next steps? Where is the frontiers for parking reform in California, at least? And so I'm going to identify 5 policy frontiers. I'll just go through them quickly because I know I want to make sure we have time for questions, which is one is expanding the removal of parking minimums, where there's all those areas that didn't include those blue dots. And that was also just the greater Los Angeles. That was in San Francisco. That was in San Diego, at least in that photo, but there are other areas. 3 cities in California of the hundreds of cities have done full repeals. San Jose being the largest one, I think, in the nation, I think right now, that has done a full repeal of parking minimums. That may not be correct, but close to correct. Culver City and Alameda. And then there's a number of other cities, big cities as well, that have done like partial repeals. Maybe they've repealed parking minimums in their downtowns, or they've repealed parking minimums. I think San Francisco basically has a full repeal, except like mortuary services. So that's like crematory services, weirdly enough. So expanding on a local advocacy level, removal of parking minimums, continuing to have those local fights on a city by city level, absolutely is one of the policy things we need to be doing. Parking maximums. Some people may recognize this is SoFi Stadium. It's the greater Los Angeles area's brand new sports and music venue. If you're one subsect of the population, you know it for the Beyonce and Taylor Swift concerts. If you're the other subsect of the population, you know it for the Super Bowl just happening here recently, which is our big sporting event. This sea of parking you're seeing right here is not because of parking minimums. This is because the developer of this land wanted to build this much parking. And so parking maximums are absolutely necessary to make sure our cities are not turning into swaths of parking lots. Curb management and car sharing. This is something I'm recently getting into myself, is so understanding how we're using the curb, how we're pricing the curb, thinking about it as a shared and finite resource that we all have and need to be thinking about as a tragedy of the commons if we don't use appropriately. On top of that, also like services like Zipcar and Turo, where you can have maybe one person in a building sharing, maybe 10 people in a building sharing one car, for an example, that's owned by the building, for an example, or a private company. Shared parking. This is an example from where I live in California. It may look like a very banal, boring strip mall, and it's somewhat as it is, but I love this strip mall because it's 3 businesses in one strip mall. It's a early in the morning cafe and diner. So all the parking is filled early in the morning. And then in the middle afternoon, it closes, and then the barbershop opens up right next door. And so in the middle afternoon, all the parking is used. And then at night, the barbershop closes, and then the bar on the far left opens up, and all the parking is used. And that's like just really smart land use policies that like we're building 13 parking spots for 3 different uses, and it makes just quite a lot of sense, even if it's just like not that pretty or that aesthetic. There's also a bill in the legislature that is tackling shared parking and reducing the regulatory burdens of shared parking. And then lastly, this is Streets for All's bill this year. I will find out in the next 5 hours whether this bill lives or dies in the Senate vote today. And this is our bill to unbundle the cost of parking. So that means if you're not familiar with that concept, if you have like just an example, $1,000 a month like rent that's unheard of in California as a side note. But $1,000 a month rent with a free parking spot. After this bill, it could be a $900 a month rent with a $100 parking spot. So it, showing the costs of parking to consumers and making sure people can get, not pay for parking that they don't need. And so this is our bill. It's so close to the governor's desk, and we hope it can get signed. And right now that bill only applies to 10 counties in California of the 58. But this is, like I said, another policy frontier that we hope that we can expand and work on. I tried to go through a lot, and I tried to go through it quickly. I apologize to the interpreter, but I wanted to relieve time for questions. So that's it on my end and in California's end.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much, Mark. So Dana, we have about 10 minutes left. So not sure if you want to pose your questions, or should we dive into the Q&A directly?
Looks like there's a good amount of questions in the Q&A. If you want to just start pulling from there, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so I think for me, what's standing out, there are a couple of questions. I think they're more for Gabriel. So let's see. Evgeny is asking actually about supportive policies that can help this parking reform be more viable. Of course, there are other activities that can help local activity, bolster walking and cycling. So what have been improvements to the public transport at the time you introduced no minimum parking? And there's a second question, if you can also maybe answer that. I'm trying to look for it. But the question was about inclusive housing, actually, if there were efforts to provide inclusive housing through this parking reform.
Well, all right. When we started the first reform, it was 2017. We've just had the Olympic Games a year prior, and with the Olympic Games, we had a lot of public transport works throughout the city, even to the farther areas of the city. So we had a new line of metro. Now we have 3. It's not sufficient by no means, but we had a new line of metro, and we had a system of BRTs, bus rapid transit, that was created at this time, and that failed miserably a couple of years later because of lack of maintenance, mostly, and other issues, mistakes in planning as well. But the Olympic Games brought a bit of attention to these transit problems, but the country as a whole, especially the state of Rio and the city of Rio, they entered a very big economic crisis right in the middle of right around the time of the Olympic Games. So public investment was zeroed. Usually these big transport developments come from the state level, like a federal, how you say it in the US, state in the US, provincial level for the others. And the Rio de Janeiro state, the province, since 2015-16, has zero money to invest on anything. It cannot borrow money because it can't pay money. So all the projects, everything that was designed, kind of stopped. But at the time we did this reform, these new infrastructures had just been built, and they were actually improving transit in the city. They transformed a lot of the city, but not as much as we would expect. But we know that there are other big projects in the pipeline. We have another bus rapid transit being commissioned, I think, next year, at the end of next year, which will be the biggest one so far. So all these things will change a bit the landscape of public transport in Rio. But what we need to know is that we can work on supply or on demand. When we do these kinds of movements, we're working on the demand side. We're creating a demand from the citizens, We're taking them from the supply side. Oh, I want new buses. I'm using the bus to take them to, I want new buses, to I want new transit, new metro, subway stations, subway lines, whatever. We are forcing more people to demand that. And so public transit, little by little, becomes a growing concern of the government. So, and the second question, if I can be reminded of it.
Yes, that was about inclusive housing. If there was some measure to also incorporate it during.
Yes. We've at the city council, the city the how to say planning department. That's it. We've started a program now to redo the central district of Rio, which was mainly commercial. In fact, residential was forbidden there for many decades, actually forbidden. You could not build a residential unit in the central district. We've taken that out, and we've created a system of compensations. If you build residential areas in downtown, you will get some bonuses elsewhere. And there are strong bonuses for public affordable housing. So far, it's starting to gain traction. It's not really yet very much active, but we've had, I think, around 400 new units, if I remember the name correctly, in the port area that's also been redeveloped near downtown. So we are trying to increase to develop this site, but it takes a bit of time because affordable housing, it has a dimension which is a finance dimension, and that the city hall cannot take that. We need to be supported by the federal government or the state government, and that poses some of the problems.
And I think it shows also how different departments have to work together to create those comprehensive policies, which is always a little bit longer term effort. So we're running out of time, but I wanted to pose this question. I guess it's for both of you, but I wanted to direct it to Mark. So as we know, in both cases, the populations rely heavily on car ownership and therefore need parking. So here's Connor from the New York City Planning Department actually asking, have you done research on how to respond to backlash by car owners against removing parking requirements?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I haven't done this research, but I think in my experience, the best thing you can do is to start with facts and logic in the room, because the conversation around parking gets so emotional and so far away from facts. And so what happened in California that was incredibly successful is that we didn't have the kind of like, oh, there will be no parking anymore conversation. We kind of moved past that. We got into more technical and nuanced questions, which were still challenging questions and still ones that I didn't agree with, but not necessarily at least. But and we were able to kind of get into more details. But I think one of the things that I was able to kind of, I was just telling someone this recently, is that, if you imagine that a floor of an underground parking garage in the US costs $1 million per floor, per subterranean floor. And each floor has, let's say, 100 cars on it. If your parking minimum is 304 parking spots, you have to spend $4 million on parking garages because you have to build a fourth floor to go beyond that maximum, because you can only fit 100 cars per floor. And so if you're built to build that other one, you have to spend an extra $1 million on the project. And that idea of that money that gets passed on because of government regulation will get passed on to the renters, or will get passed on to the business owners, is something that if you can break down those barriers, is clearly understood. And that's why, like I always say, that parking minimums isn't necessarily about transit access. It's about reducing the government getting in the way from our cities meeting their potential. And I'm also advocating for transit, and that's also part of my day job as well. But I almost see them as like distinct conversations in some sense, because I think removing parking minimums is like removing lead pipes. It's a universal good.
If I can say a quick thing, the thing to do is give the option. If people have the option, you can buy an apartment with or without parking. Let them choose it. Let the people who build choose it, and see what sells and what doesn't sell. That's it. Don't get in the way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I would also point just very quickly to a good example of this. It was actually in Edmonton, Alberta. They, a couple of years ago, did a really interesting approach to like off-street parking reform. I think they called it like open choice parking. So really leaning into like the choice. It didn't mean that that buildings couldn't provide parking, but there was the choice to then use that space for other things. And I think that really helps people understand that, you know, removing parking minimums doesn't mean you're taking away all this existing parking. It's just that like as new buildings are built and buildings are redeveloped, there's less parking that's being provided potentially. So I think just like reframing that conversation around choice is actually really, really useful.
Right. There is a quick question here, and I want to be mindful of the time that we actually run out. But if you can answer either yes or no, or like in 10 seconds, Yusuf is asking, do you find removal of parking minimums will convince transit authorities to build more transit? Gabriel.
In the long run, yes, no doubt about it.
Okay, Mark.
In the long run, yes, but I think the one caveat is that in the US, our transit and land use authorities are very distinct, and that can be a challenge. If they were the same, I think the answer would be a more clear yes.
Definitely. Dana?
I think what it might do is actually help to build up density around transit. I know in DC, we're looking at kind of like park and ride parking lots around transit stations, and they're really underutilized. And that space could be better used for things like housing right next to a metro station, for example.
Great, thank you so much for those quickie answers. So I'm going to wrap up this session. Of course, I wanted to thank you, Dana, Gabriel, and Mark for participating today. We learned a lot. I know we didn't have a chance to get into all the questions, but hopefully with more work, the publications, and more engagement, we can dig in more to those lessons learned. Also, thank you, audience, for sharing your input on the interpretation and your needs in terms of language access. So I hope you were able to participate. We are gathering those insights for the future webinars. I wanted to mention that our next webinar will be on September 26th, focusing on work that ITDP and partners have been doing around implementing electric bus fleets, looking specifically at Jakarta, Indonesia, and Salvador, Brazil. So link to registration should be in the chat right now. And with that, I wanted to thank everyone. Thank you, the audience, for joining, and see you at the next session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to put my email in the chat if there are follow-up questions. Happy to answer any.
I will do the same.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, then we'll hold on.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all again.
Bye.
See you soon. Happy parking day, by the way.